Picture this. You're outside the royal birthing chamber in the heart of Madrid. The air is thick with incense and tension as servants rush back and forth, their whispers sharp as knives. Behind the heavy oak doors, a queen screams. It's 1661, and all of Spain holds its breath. Finally, silence. A midwife emerges, her hands trembling and stained with blood. She does not smile. She does not announce the birth of a prince. Instead, she looks out at the gathered nobles and mutters, "He's not right." Inside, the Queen of Spain lies unconscious. Beside her, swaddled in silk and met with horror, is her newborn son, the child who will become Charles II. At first glance, he appears fragile and malformed, strangely silent. His tongue is too large for his mouth. His jaw juts out unnaturally. His body is limp. He cannot nurse. He cannot cry. And yet, the nurses bow. The nobles applaud because he is royal, because he is a Habsburg. What none of them say aloud is what everyone can see. This child is a warning. The consequence of a dynasty so obsessed with its own bloodline that it is folded in on itself like decaying silk. He is not merely a baby. He is a curse draped in finery. And they will all pretend. They will pretend that this is acceptable, that a boy who cannot suckle, cannot move, cannot focus his eyes is somehow destined to rule an empire. But behind closed doors, the whispers begin. He is bewitched, a punishment for their pride. God would not make a king like him. Yet he will be made king, because this is Spain, and the House of Habsburg has spent centuries sealing its fate with kisses between cousins. This day marks the beginning of their reckoning. Royal blood, that's the phrase they use. It sounds divine, majestic, untouchable. But what no one dares to admit is that royal blood isn't sacred. It is poison, twisted upon itself. Generation after generation of cousins marrying cousins, uncles wedding their nieces, bloodlines spiraling inwards like a snake devouring its own tail. At the center of this genetic labyrinth stands the Habsburgs, Europe's most powerful family and perhaps its most biologically doomed. To understand how a single child could be born so catastrophically broken, we must go back centuries. The Habsburg dynasty had one obsession: purity. They did not trust outsiders. They trusted only themselves. Thus, they married within their own family repeatedly. The Spanish and Austrian branches fused into a grotesque tree, knotted and diseased, a family tree lacking branches, curling inward like a clenched fist. Joanna of Austria, an ancestor of the Queen, was the product of generations of inbreeding so severe that her family portrait resembled a hall of mirrors. Each face familiar, each jawline grotesquely exaggerated. This so-called Habsburg jaw wasn't just an oddity, it was a visible warning sign. A jaw so pronounced that some couldn't chew. A tongue so swollen that they struggled to speak. Mental illness, epilepsy, infertility, all lurked beneath the gilded surface of palace life. Ignored, inconvenient truths denied because they were unbearable. By the 17th century, the inbreeding coefficient among the Spanish Habsburgs surpassed that of direct siblings. Entire lineages became living experiments in genetic collapse. They looked regal on the surface, draped in silk, crowned in gold, but within, their bodies were crumbling, their minds slipping away. Mariana of Austria, both niece and wife to the previous king, was chosen not for love but for blood. She represented the ideal Habsburg match because she was already a Habsburg. She and her husband, Philip IV, shared more genetic material than that found between a parent and child. When Mariana became pregnant, the court rejoiced, a future heir, a continuation of the dynasty. Yet what they failed to realize was that the dynasty had already poisoned itself beyond repair. The child she carried was not a savior, he was a warning. The moment he was born, the midwives sensed something was amiss. The child did not cry, did not move. His limbs were limp, his skin a sickly gray. When they finally heard a sound from him, it was less a wail and more a wet, gurgling cough. The court physicians scrambled to reassure the royal family. They said he was simply weak, that he would grow stronger with time, that miracles happened in royal households. But no miracle was coming. This child was not just ill. He was the culmination of centuries of poor decisions made by monarchs who believed themselves above nature's laws, a genetic dead end adorned with a crown. And yet they called him His Catholic Majesty. They clothed him in finery, draped him in jewels, celebrated his birth as if he were Spain's salvation. In truth, he was a curse-given flesh-a-boy who could scarcely swallow, whose tongue was too large for his mouth, whose bones didn't harden properly. Yet the kingdom conformed to the illusion, denying reality, elevating him onto a throne his body was never meant to bear. Because the empire needed a king, and Charles, broken or not, was the only heir they had. They named him Charles II, King of Spain, defender of the Catholic faith, ruler of a vast empire that stretched from the Americas to the Philippines. But behind the titles and the gold-threaded garments stood a boy who could barely stand. From the moment Charles entered the world, his body betrayed him. He was born with a head too large for his frail frame, a misshapen skull throbbing unnaturally in the candlelight. His tongue was so swollen he could hardly close his mouth, let alone speak. As an infant, he couldn't nurse. As a child, he couldn't chew. He choked on bread and gagged on meat, drooling constantly, forcing his nurses to mop his chin with cloths day and night. His first teeth didn't emerge until he was nearly 4. He didn't walk until after 5, and when he finally did, it was with a shambling, uncertain gait that made courtiers avert their eyes, ashamed to look directly at their king. Yet the empire cheered, pretending everything was fine. To admit that something was wrong with Charles meant acknowledging that something was wrong with the entire house of Habsburg, so they lied. They adorned failure in accolades, calling his silences contemplative rather than symptomatic, referring to his delays as signs of divine mystery rather than indicating brain damage. Behind palace walls, however, reality seeped through the facade. His tutors despaired. He could not read or write fluently. He was described as mentally slow, unable to concentrate, disturbed by loud noises and bright lights. He would stare for hours at flickering candles or trace the embroidery on his robes as if it were a map to another world. When spoken to, he rarely responded, and when corrected, he pouted like a toddler. There were times he became inexplicably violent, slapping servants, tearing at his own clothing, chewing on the corners of furniture. One ambassador reported, "The king seems more like a creature preserved by divine accident than a ruler ordained by God," another simply noted, "He is not long for this world." Yet Charles lived, not out of strength but from sheer, grim inertia. His survival became a political performance, a grotesque endurance act. His mother, Queen Mariana, ruled in his stead, whispering orders behind closed doors, signing decrees in his name, using her son's broken body as a shield while wielding real power. Each time Charles was paraded before the public slumped in his golden litter, eyes glassy, head lolling to the side people were reminded that the king still lived. And if he lived, then the empire lived, even as both were already rotting from within. At court, the atmosphere grew tense. Ministers spoke in hushed tones. Priests hovered as if waiting for a death that never arrived. Charles was kept in rooms scented with incense to mask the odor of his infections. His bed linens had to be changed twice a day because he could not control his bowels. Yet still, flattering portraits were painted, depicting radiant lies. They gave him strong cheekbones, confident eyes, a hint of a smile, erasing the slack jaw, the sunken gaze, the twitching lips that revealed the truth. The king was crumbling, but he had to be presented. He had to be believed in because there was no one else to take his place. The dynasty had bet everything on this fragile boy. They needed him to survive, to marry, to produce an heir. Even as his bones softened and his mind unraveled, the court continued to whisper plans for his future, stating that the king would marry a French princess and sire sons, that the line would continue. But deep down, they all knew Charles would not save the dynasty. He was its punishment. As he grew older, the line between man and marionette blurred. He was dressed, positioned, presented, but never truly present. He sat on the throne like a ghost made of flesh, vacant, gurgling, trembling. They crowned him with gold, but the crown sat heavily on a head that had never finished forming. The court knew how to lie. It had been doing so for centuries. Yet never had the performance been as grotesque, fragile, and terrifyingly absurd as it was under Charles II. They were not just lying to the people. They were lying to themselves. The truth was unbearable. The boy they crowned was not a king. He was a collapsing body with a royal title. The empire itself had become a stage designed to maintain the illusion that everything was fine. The walls of El Escorial glittered with candlelight and silence. Courtiers spoke in measured tones, always smiling, always bowing, always pretending. Every servant, every minister, every ambassador became players in a theater of denial. If the king stared blankly through them, he was just deep in thought. If he babbled incoherently during a council meeting, it was merely his unique style of governance. If he failed to respond at all, they nodded solemnly, interpreting his silence as wisdom. The portrait painters became complicit, crafting images of Charles II that bordered on fantasy healthy, poised, regal. They trimmed his jawline, softened the slope of his forehead, straightened his hunched shoulders. In paint he looked like a monarch. In flesh he resembled a dying man dressed for his own funeral. Foreign dignitaries came to court, expecting majesty, only to find a parade of theater masks. One French envoy reported, "I do not know what horrifies me more, the king or the way they pretend he is well." Banquets were held in his honor, where Charles sat drooling into his goblet, unable to lift his spoon while musicians played for him as he blinked vacantly into space. A court dwarf once slipped during a performance and accidentally voiced the unspoken truth. "This is a kingdom ruled by a corpse." The man disappeared by morning. But it wasn't just the king who was disintegrating. The entire fabric of royal governance was unraveling. Ministries fell into infighting, and nobles jockeyed for access to the regent queen, who wielded power behind the veil of motherhood. Religious fanatics saw Charles as proof of divine punishment and began infiltrating court life. Priests whispered of exorcisms, nobles spread rumors of curses. When crops failed or storms battered the coasts, the blame fell on the king's unnatural condition. Some believed he was bewitched, others believed he was the witch. In the center of it all, Charles remained a silent sun in a dying solar system. His days were structured down to the minute, not out of duty but out of fear. If left alone too long, he might harm himself. If made to walk too far, he might collapse. If told the truth, he might scream. Queen Mariana maintained a tight grip, controlling who could speak to him, touch him, or see him in his most vulnerable moments. She edited his correspondence, forged his decisions, and read his thoughts aloud when he could not speak. He was a puppet, and she was the puppeteer, desperate to maintain the illusion of control as the empire unraveled behind her. In the palace chapel, prayers echoed endlessly. Priests chanted for the king's health, for his mind, for his legacy. Despite everything, his drooling, his seizures, his inability to complete a full sentence, the court was preparing for marriage. They still believed, or pretended to believe, that Charles could produce an heir, that this bloodline, so poisoned and broken, could stretch one generation further. But as foreign suitors arrived, they saw the truth. One French princess, upon meeting Charles for the first time, reportedly fainted. Another refused to remove her gloves, fearing contagion from the very air around her. Yet the court kept clapping, kept bowing, kept smiling, because to admit the truth would mean unraveling the empire. So they did what they had always done. They pointed to the crown, kissed his ring, and proclaimed, "Long live the king," even as his mind unraveled, his body broke, and Spain began to die alongside him. By the time Charles turned 20, the whispers had grown into thunder. They called him the bewitched king, El Hechizado, as if his afflictions could be blamed on dark magic rather than centuries of inbreeding. His body was failing faster than his courtiers could cover it up. His jaw sagged open most days, drool threading down his chin. His hair fell in clumps. His skin took on a waxy yellow hue, like a candle left too close to the flame. His once vacant eyes became haunted, twitching in their sockets as though searching for an escape from the skull that contained them. And still he ruled. Still, he sat on the throne, this massive decay wrapped in velvet and crowned with gold. Marriage became the court's next great fiction. They needed an heir to prove that the broken body in the palace could somehow continue the bloodline. So they chose a bride, Marie-Louise of Orleans, niece to Louis XIV of France. A girl of 17, vivacious, terrified, and utterly unprepared for the world she was about to enter. On her wedding night, she was led to the royal bedchamber like a sacrifice. Charles lay waiting naked, trembling, confused. What transpired in that room became legend. Some say he wept. Others say he prayed. Some say he simply stared at her, unsure of what to do until attendants were summoned to explain. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain. No child was conceived, not that night, not ever. Doctors were called in, remedies were prepared. Potions were administered, Spanish fly, ground pearls, and even powdered deer penis. Subscribe to our channel and hit the bell to support our work. Never miss an upload. Like this vid, drop a comment and share it with others to help us grow this historical community.